Just how bad or good is previous gen hardware when it comes to PC gaming? I know you budget ballers may already fully comprehend that you can still have a good time with just what you got, but I've seen a trend where the casual audience thinks that anything other than current gen just sucks. This entire gaming PC costs less than $750 and almost everything about it is previous gen in some way. I'm going to show you how to build this and see what it's capable of, and I also have a surprise for you during the benchmarking section. All of that after a word from today's sponsor. The Corsair 3500X ARGB case, and yeah, there's nothing previous gen about this one whatsoever. Recently launched from Corsair, I love how they're finally embracing the fish tank meta, and this one's packing some serious features. Despite the extra glass, it still has a ton of room for water cooling and extra fans, as it can support multiple 360mm radiators in addition to the three 120mm RS120 ARGB fans that come up here in the front. There's 3 different versions depending on which fans you want, or no fans at all if you want to save some money. They sent me both the black and white 3500X ARGB versions, and I immediately got to work filling up the white one, and this build turned out incredible. I added some extra Corsair fans up top and one in the back to really fill out the case, and the completed build looks great. The 3500X also supports ASUS and MSI reverse connection motherboards if you want to go down that path, and obviously this will fit pretty much any graphics card that you want to put in here. I'll have a link to the 3500X down in the description, and thanks again to Corsair for sponsoring today's video. Alright, so for every part, I'm not just going to explain why I chose it, but we're also going to talk about what you're losing by going with the previous gen. Starting with the CPU, this is the Ryzen 7 5700X, and it's probably the least controversial part out of this whole build. The 5700X and AM4 CPUs just in general are still pretty relevant, despite AM5 dominating in the mid-range to higher end builds. The 5700X packs 8 cores and 16 threads that can boost up to 4.6 GHz, and it's honestly not going to bottleneck many of the highest of end GPUs, if at all. For $161, it's still rocking some serious value because on the new market, the cheapest AM5 CPU that most people go with is the 7600 for about $20 to $30 more. Sure, this 7500F could be had for cheaper, but that's from AliExpress, which most people aren't willing to do. Now, the benefits of going with AM4 are that you can get a much cheaper motherboard and the cheaper DDR4 RAM, but what are the downsides? For one, the upgrade path isn't nearly as good as if you went with a current gen Ryzen 7000 CPU. We love the AM4 platform because of upgradability, but when you start out towards the highest end of it, there's not much more room for you to go. The only real upgrade from here would be the 5800X3D, possibly the new chips coming out this month, but all of those aren't really a beefy jump and probably not realistic to most people.
It'll cost you $5,000 to get to level 3, and I don't feel any different.
On the flip side, if you went with AM5, that socket is supported through the year 2027 at least, so you'd be able to upgrade that 7600 to a 9700X and probably a 10700X or whatever they decide to call the generation after that. The other thing you're losing is PCIe Generation 5. Gen 4 is all that's supported on AM4 chips, but honestly for most people, it's just not that big of a deal. PCIe Gen 5 has twice the data transfer rate of Gen 4, and some of those Gen 5 drives are super beastly, but for a pure gaming PC, it's just not gonna matter that much. If you're a video editor where you can feel every ounce of SSD speed, it would be a high priority, but for gaming, a Gen 4 drive is still plenty fast enough. And for graphics cards, I don't think many, if any of them, are actually fully utilizing what Gen 4 can offer, so for GPUs, I would consider this a non-factor right now. Moving on to the motherboard for today's build, I went with an MSI B550A Pro, and I picked this up for $62 on Amazon Warehouse. Now sure, there may be a few drawbacks of a B550 compared to a B650, but the advantage is that you can snag these for super cheap, and that will in turn give you more of your budget for the components that actually increase your FPS. Amazon Warehouse is a great spot to pick up used motherboards like this because you can save a ton of money on them, and if something's wrong with it, it's just a super easy Amazon return. It's very minimal risk. This B550 motherboard also comes with some modern features like a USB-C connector and a Gen 4 SSD, and speaking of which, we're not taking advantage of that because for today's project, it's a previous gen build. The SSD we're using is a Team Group MP33, and yes, the physical SSD I used is just a 512GB model, but let's pretend that we went with 1TB. Truth is, Newegg keeps giving us these 512GB drives for free because we order so many parts from there, so I have a ton of them to use. I definitely don't recommend buying a 512GB SSD here in 2024. Again, I'm just using it because I got a bunch of them. Anyways, the MP33 is only a Gen 3 SSD, which is actually 2 generations out of date now. In my opinion, Gen 5 drives are only for the ultimate ballers or people like video editors, like I just said, where again, they'll be able to notice those extra speeds, but I do think that everyone should be building with Gen 4 these days. Now don't get me wrong, this Gen 3 MP33 is still very fast compared to a 2.5-inch SSD and obviously a spinning HDD, but the reason why everyone should be on Gen 4 is simply just because of pricing. The cost of a 1TB Gen 4 SSD is about the same as a Gen 3 SSD, so it really doesn't make sense not to go with it. Gen 4 speeds can reach over double the speeds of most Gen 3s, so you might as well take advantage of it. I went with the Gen 3 drive because this is a previous gen type of build, and again, because I have a bunch of them, this is probably the one component in this entire build that you definitely should not copy. Moving on, we have the RAM, and this is the Team Group Delta RGB 2x8GB kit that's clocked at 3200 MHz. I actually buy a lot of these for our Frostnova gaming PCs over on ZTTbuilds.com, and this is just the most consistent, reliable, and inexpensive white with RGB DDR4 kit that you can find. The DDR5 version is also pretty great as well. The debate between the current gen DDR5 versus previous gen DDR4 isn't an easy comparison like the rest of the components. Your motherboard will only be able to support one type of DDR, so it's not like you'll have to make that choice afterwards. You make that choice when you're deciding on your CPU and motherboard. All AM4 CPUs only work with DDR4, so that's easy. All AM5 CPUs only work with DDR5, and the only time you have a choice is with LGA 1700 CPUs, which are Intel 12, 13th, and 14th gen. There is definitely a speed increase going from DDR4 to DDR5, and that will translate to more FPS, but we're not really losing any features with going with DDR4. I do think 2 to 3 years from now, it'll hurt just a bit more if you're still on DDR4. Think about the gamers that are on DDR3 right now. Sure, their PCs can still play games, but it's not really desirable to go with DDR3 anymore. I'm sure if you asked any of them, they would tell you that they definitely want to upgrade to DDR4. All right, moving on. Next up, we have the power supply, and I did even manage to make this previous gen as well, kind of. This is the MSI A750BM, which I grabbed for $70 off Amazon. Power supplies don't really come out in a sequential generation like other components do, but there is a new generation standard that a lot of the new ones are now on. Newer power supplies can now be at ATX 3.0 and PCIe Gen 5 certified, and that's indeed what I recommend getting for a brand new build, especially if you're going with an NVIDIA 40 series graphics card. Neither one of those specs will really help us in our build today, but the PCIe Gen 5 and 12 volt high power connector could definitely come in handy with more expensive builds. The ATX 3.0 tag also basically ensures that it passed at least up to tier B rating on the PSU tier list, so definitely pick one of those up if you can and you want to spend the extra money. For a previous gen sub $750 build, this tier C A750BN is perfectly fine. Next up is the case, and this is the Cooler Master HAF 500. Not a fan. I would actually count this as a previous gen as well because it's not a fish tank, wood grain, or the other current metas, but the main reason I got it was just because of a sale. On Amazon Prime Day, this came down to $70, and for an all-white ATX sized with 4 ARGB fans, I consider that some solid value, at least on paper. The HAF series has been out for over a decade now, but this one is actually not that old. It's rocking two 200mm massive fans up at the front, one 120 in the back, and even this one specifically for the GPU. You can actually angle this however you want depending on the size of your GPU, and in theory, this should give some direct fresh air from underneath the case and guide it directly up to your graphics card. What that results in is a massive amount of air moving from front to back, as well as some supplemental air moving from the bottom and traveling directly to your GPU. The airflow situation in here is pretty solid, but I'm not gonna lie, I did not have fun building inside of this thing at all. I streamed this build over on my Twitch live stream, which is always linked down in the description, by the way, and we're also always running a giveaway like this build, which is going on right now, but yeah, I struggled a bit with this case. The PSU situation is very funky because you have to slide the power supply in from the front side of the PSU basement, which means you have to remove this HDD cage and angled fan. It was super janky. I also thought that this case would aesthetically look better without having the 3-decade-old HDD cage in here at all, but I didn't notice until after I removed it that the PSU basement doesn't have a wall here, so without the cage, you'd just be looking at the inside of the PSU basement. This is always the perfect spot for you to stuff in all those extra PSU cables, especially when you're using a non-modular power supply like we are, so not having that option kind of sucks. Look how you can kind of see these cables peeking out here, so dumb. There were some other quirks with the cable management process, and overall, I honestly wouldn't recommend going with this case unless you just really love the design of it for whatever reason. It's fine and it'll work, but there are better options out there even at this $70 sale price. Now, one thing I definitely would recommend are these cable extensions. These extensions are from Asia Horse, and I'm honestly always a fan of whenever we can sneak in a white and purple themed build. Asia Horse actually sent these to me as a gift like over a year ago, and I finally found a good spot for them. For about 25 bucks, they take the aesthetics of your build to the next level, but of course, if you go with a colored option other than black or white, you're limiting yourself with the RGB color options. The only reasonable choices we could make for the lights are white and purple. And finally, the last component that we have to cover, and you better believe this one is previous gen as well, it's the XFX Swift 309 RX 6700 XT, and I scored this for $250 on eBay used. For those of you that are new to PC building, the 6700 6700 XT was one of the absolute best FPS per dollar GPUs back when the 6000 generation was the newest, so that means it's definitely still packing a punch. This is a borderline 1080p to 1440p graphics card, and with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, it is a safe bet for the next 2 to 3 years. We'll cover the benchmarks here in just a bit, but going with the previous generation here also does not really introduce any negatives that we really need to worry about. It's got enough VRAM, like I said, even for the most demanding titles. It supports all of AMD's current software technology, although that does have the potential to change in the future. Think about how certain DLSS versions only work with the current gen NVIDIA GPUs. So as of right now, the 6700 XT is still a great choice, even though there is some monster value with the current gen 7700 XT. And per usual, don't sleep on the RX 6800. I know a lot of you are a big fan of that card, and you tell me that every single day. So all in all, here's what the final parts list is looking like for my previous gen gaming PC, and the total comes out to just under $750. This is indeed accounting for a full 1TB NVMe drive, like I said earlier, and it even includes the $25 cable extensions as well. For $750 on paper, this is screaming some value, so let's run some benchmarks and test that out to be sure. Now, real quickly, the surprise that I was talking about in the intro is that we're going to be uploading a standalone video on the ZTT Extras channel, which is all about properly benchmarking this PC. Usually in these build videos on the main channel, we like to keep it quick and tight going through these benchmarks, so if you want to see a lot more games and longer gameplay clips to show exactly how this 5700X and RX 6700 XT combo can perform, make sure you're subscribed to the ZTT Extras channel, which is linked down in the description. But yeah, so for the first benchmark, we ran our standard 3D Mark tests, and for Time Spy, we got a really solid score of 12,292, and Steel Nomad got 2,430. That's a 16x multiplier on Time Spy, which I definitely like to see, especially for a non-pure performance, every last FPS for your dollar kind of build. Next up, we jumped into some Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and in 1080p, we cranked the settings up to Ultra, which we did for almost every game here, and we got a very solid FPS average of 182. Here's Cyberpunk 2077, which we also put in 1080p Ultra settings, and we got 89 FPS. For Starfield, we knocked the settings down to high, which still makes the game look amazing, and with that, we got a 65 FPS average. And finally, here's XDefiant in 1080p Ultra settings, which landed right on the mark for a higher refresh rate monitor at 144 FPS. Here's the rest of the games we tested, and clearly this 6700 XT can still handle all the titles at 1080p high or Ultra settings, and we definitely could have pushed some, or if not all of these, up to 1440p if we really wanted to. Once again, to see a longer form benchmarking run for this build, be sure to check out the ZTT Extras YouTube channel. But yeah, hopefully we accomplished our mission of proving to you that previous gen hardware can still crank it up in 1080p high to Ultra settings, and it's a good experience. And as one more final reminder, the ZTT Extras channel is linked on the screen right now.